It was the kind of job that many would have dismissed as uneventful, the kind of job you took when you had nowhere else to turn. I didn't expect it to be anything more than a quiet, lonely shift under the dim glow of cemetery lights, surrounded by rows of old tombstones. But as anyone who's worked the night shift knows, sometimes it's the quietest jobs that hide the most unsettling things. I'd been working the graveyard shift at Red Hollow Cemetery for about 6 months. The place was isolated, sitting just outside town, surrounded by dense woods that swallowed up any sound that might dare to break the stillness. Most nights, I sat in the small maintenance shed near the gates, nursing a cup of coffee, watching the clock tick by. The only company I had were the occasional birds that flapped through the trees or the rustling leaves that whispered in the wind. It wasn't much, but it was enough for me, or so I thought. It was a Wednesday night when I first noticed it. I had just finished my usual rounds, walking along the stone paths, checking the gate locks, ensuring the lights were working. Red Hollow wasn't a large cemetery, but it was old. Some of the gravestones were centuries old, some broken or weathered beyond recognition. The statues, too, stone angels, cross-bearing figures, and carved animals, stood like silent sentinels, watching over the graves, seemingly frozen in time. But one statue caught my eye that night. It was a tall figure of a woman, draped in a long, flowing gown, her face hidden beneath a veil. She was positioned near the entrance of the cemetery, right where the path curved toward the main gate. I had passed her countless times before, but this time something felt off. I don't know why, but I felt the sudden urge to stand there and stare at it. The longer I looked, the more uneasy I became. Something about her posture seemed wrong, unnatural. She was positioned slightly off-center, and though the statue was old, weathered with age, it appeared as if it had been recently shifted, as though it had moved. I dismissed the thought, chalking it up to fatigue. It was the middle of the night after all, and I had been walking the same path for hours. My mind was just playing tricks on me. I turned away, heading back to the shed to finish my shift. The night passed uneventfully, and by the time the sun began to rise, I had forgotten about the statue. But as I walked out to lock up for the morning, I couldn't help but glance over at it again. To my surprise, the statue was closer to the entrance. It wasn't much, just a few inches, but it was enough for me to notice. At first, I thought I was imagining things. The light of the morning was still weak, casting long shadows over the cemetery. I hadn't been paying close attention the night before, had I? Maybe it had always been that way. I told myself I was being paranoid and shrugged it off. But something gnawed at me as I locked the gates and prepared to leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something was changing. I had a whole week to think about it before my next shift. And when I returned the following Friday, the unease was still there. The sun was already setting as I drove up the gravel road that led to the cemetery. The trees stood silent, their twisted limbs like dark fingers reaching for the sky. I parked in the lot near the gates and stepped out of the truck, taking a deep breath. The air felt cold tonight, colder than usual. I locked the truck and walked toward the gates. As I got closer to the entrance, I couldn't help but glance toward the statue. This time, it was even closer to the gates. The gap between her and the entrance was unmistakable. I froze. The distance between the statue and the gate had narrowed significantly. I didn't know how, but I knew something was wrong. This wasn't just my imagination anymore. The statue had moved. I stood there for a moment, staring at it in disbelief. My heart was beating harder now, my hands cold and clammy. I had to be sure. Maybe there was some logical explanation. Maybe someone had moved it for maintenance or repairs, though I couldn't remember anything in the logs about that. But no, I knew better. I knew something strange was happening here. I glanced around the cemetery. Everything was still as it should be. The silence hung thick in the air. I knew that whatever was going on, whatever had made that statue shift, wasn't something I could explain away so easily. That night, I walked around the cemetery again, but this time, my footsteps were slower, more deliberate. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me. Each time I passed that statue, my eyes were drawn to it. I had a compulsion to look at it to make sure it wasn't moving again. It was then that I noticed something else, something that made my blood run cold. The shadow of the statue, long and thin under the flickering streetlight, was no longer where it should have been. The shadow had moved too, and in the stillness of the night I could have sworn I heard the faintest sound, a soft scrape like stone on stone coming from the direction of the statue. I had to get to the bottom of this. The night stretched on, the darkness thick and oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, not just with the statue, but with the entire cemetery. It was as though the stillness around me was hiding something waiting to be uncovered. I had to find out what was causing this unsettling shift. After my rounds, I found myself unable to go back to the shed. I paced around the cemetery instead, my mind racing. Why was the statue moving? Was I just imagining things, or was something actually happening here? I approached the statue again, this time taking a long, careful look. The figure of the woman, draped in her long gown and veil, seemed almost lifelike in the moonlight. Her posture hadn't changed, but I knew now, without a doubt, that she was closer to the gates. It wasn't just my perception. There was no denying it. I stared at the stone figure for a while, trying to reason with myself. Maybe it was the weather. Maybe the ground around her had shifted, or someone had moved her for some reason. But all these explanations felt weak, as if I was desperately trying to convince myself that I wasn't witnessing something unnatural. Then, I did something I hadn't done before. I looked at the ground around her. The earth was solid and undisturbed, just as it had been the day before. There were no signs of recent movement, no footprints, no tools left behind. The statue hadn't been moved manually. This left only one option. Somehow, the statue itself was shifting. I couldn't help but laugh nervously at myself. It sounded ridiculous. Statues didn't move. But there was something about the scene in front of me. Something about the way the statue now loomed even closer to the gate that filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. I had to get to the bottom of this. But as the night wore on, things began to take on a different tone. I couldn't stop watching the statue. Every time I walked past it, I felt as though it was staring at me, its stone eyes fixed on me, unmoving, but somehow aware. I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. Then, the noise started. It was faint at first, a light, scraping sound, barely noticeable above the gentle rustling of the trees. I froze, listening intently. It was coming from the direction of the statue. I crept closer, my steps slow, careful, as if I were approaching a wild animal. The scraping continued, a rhythmic sound like stone shifting against stone. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, my breath shallow and quick. I rounded the corner of the cemetery path, coming up behind the statue. The noise stopped as soon as I reached it, but the statue was closer again. I stumbled back, my feet tangling as I tried to retreat. The statue wasn't just close to the entrance now, it was right against the edge of the path, inches away from the gate. The scraping had been real. It wasn't in my head. My mind raced with possibilities. Was someone playing a prank on me? But the sheer thought of someone sneaking into the cemetery at night, moving a statue in silence without a trace, seemed impossible. There were no other workers, no security guards, no visitors at this hour. The cemetery was mine to watch over, and yet, the evidence was in front of me. I had to tell someone, but who would believe me? Who would believe that a statue was slowly but surely creeping toward the entrance night after night? As the night dragged on, I made a decision. I would stay awake, I would keep watch. I needed to see for myself if the statue would move again, and if it did, I needed to know how it was happening. I sat in the shed, nervously glancing out the window every few minutes, waiting for something, anything to happen. The cemetery was silent, almost painfully so. The shadows stretched longer with every passing hour, and my nerves were fraying, ready to snap. Around 2 a.m., it happened again. The scraping noise returned, soft at first, but it grew louder, more distinct. I bolted from the shed, running toward the path where the statue stood. I could hear it now, stone dragging on stone, almost like something, or someone, was pushing it. I reached the corner, half expecting to see some prankster lurking in the shadows. But there was no one. The statue was closer, almost right against the gate now. I stood frozen, my pulse pounding in my ears. This couldn't be real. There had to be an explanation. But deep down, I knew there wasn't. The statue had moved on its own. It had shifted again, and I couldn't explain why. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the stone figure. The woman's face was hidden beneath her veil, but somehow I felt like she was looking at me, her stone eyes piercing through the veil, her presence heavier than the night around me. I turned to leave, my breath shallow, my mind reeling, but as I walked away I heard it again. Scrape, scrape, scrape. This time it wasn't as faint. The sound was sharp, deliberate, as if something was pushing the statue with intent. I ran back to the shed, slammed the door shut, and locked it behind me. I couldn't stay out there any longer. I couldn't take it. The fear was starting to overwhelm me. I had to get out. I needed to leave this place before whatever was happening here escalated any further. But no matter how hard I tried to leave, I knew I wouldn't be able to rest until I figured out why the statue kept moving and what it meant. By the time I finished my shift that morning, I was beyond exhausted. I couldn't shake the image of the statue's hollow stone face, the way it had seemingly inched closer to the entrance with each passing night. Something in my gut told me I wasn't dealing with something ordinary. And yet I had no proof, just my growing sense of unease and the whispers of fear that seemed to fill the air every time I walked past the statue. I couldn't keep telling myself I was imagining things. The movement was real. I had seen it with my own eyes, heard it with my own ears, but I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone about it. Who would believe a cemetery worker, a nobody like me, with a story about a statue that moved on its own? But I also couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the statue there, standing just inches from the entrance, its stone eyes unblinking, staring into me. The silence of the cemetery was suffocating, and my thoughts kept looping back to that same question. Why was it moving? The next night, I decided to confront it head-on. I would stay awake, keep watch, and figure out what was really happening. I couldn't let the fear take over. I had to know what was going on. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the darkness spread across Red Hollow Cemetery, I prepared myself for another long night. I parked my truck, grabbed my flashlight, and walked toward the gates. I glanced at the statue. It was still in its usual spot, closer to the entrance than it had been the night before. I swallowed hard. There was no denying it now. The statue had moved again. I stayed by the gates for hours, waiting for something to happen. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that there was a logical explanation. Maybe the ground was shifting. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. But the longer I watched, the more impossible it seemed to deny the truth. Around midnight, I heard it again, the faint scrape, as though something was dragging across stone. My blood ran cold. I darted toward the statue, flashlight trembling in my hand. The closer I got, the louder the sound became. It was unmistakable now, the sound of stone moving, the eerie scraping echoing through the cemetery. I rounded the corner to the path where the statue stood. It was closer to the entrance, much closer. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. How was this possible? No one was here. No one could have moved the statue. Yet there it was, inching ever closer, as if it were alive, as if it had a purpose. I wasn't imagining it. The statue was moving, slowly, methodically, and it was coming toward me. I couldn't breathe. My head spun as I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. I had to get away. I had to leave this place, but I knew I couldn't, not until I understood what was happening. Then, through the silence, I heard something that stopped me dead in my tracks. A voice, soft, barely audible, as if coming from far away. "Help me." I froze. I couldn't tell if it was real or if it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The words lingered in the air, suspended like a breath, before fading into the night. I turned, my flashlight casting a wavering beam through the cemetery. Nothing. I was alone. But I wasn't sure anymore, not with the statue so much closer to the gate. I took a shaky step toward it, my legs like jelly, my breath shallow. The statue's stone eyes seemed to follow me, though they had no expression, no life. But still I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching, aware of me, waiting for something. I approached cautiously, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Was this some sort of twisted prank? Was someone hiding in the cemetery, moving the statue piece by piece to mess with me? Or was I truly losing my grip on reality? I reached out to touch the base of the statue, my hand trembling. The stone was cold, just like it had always been. But as I placed my palm against it, I felt something. A pulse. For a split second, it felt like there was a heartbeat under the stone. The ground beneath me seemed to thrum with a low vibrating hum. I jerked my hand away, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to make of it. It was as if the cemetery itself was alive, breathing, watching, waiting. Then the scrape came again, louder, sharper. It was coming from the statue. This time, I didn't wait. I turned and sprinted for the shed, my feet pounding against the gravel path, the sound of my breath drowning out everything else. I locked myself inside, gasping for air. The scraping continued outside, louder now, as if the statue was trying to break free of its pedestal, dragging itself toward the gates. I pressed my back against the wall, my eyes wide, straining to hear over the noise. It felt like I was suffocating, like the walls of the shed were closing in on me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. Dead silence. I waited, my ears straining in the quiet. The scraping had ceased, but the unease didn't fade. I couldn't bring myself to leave the shed. I couldn't bear to go back out there to see the statue any closer to the entrance. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be happening, and for the first time, I realized the truth. I was no longer alone here. Something had changed. Something was moving in the shadows. Something was waiting. I had to figure out what it was before it was too late. The next few hours were an agonizing blur. I stayed locked inside the shed, my body tense, eyes darting to the window every time a gust of wind made the trees sway. Every little noise had me on edge, every shift in the dark, making my heart race faster than the last. I couldn't stop thinking about the scraping sound, the pulse under the stone, the voice I had heard. It was all too much. I needed to know what was happening, but I was terrified. The silence outside had become unbearable, the kind of quiet that presses down on your chest, suffocating you with its weight. I had to face it. I had to confront whatever was out there. I waited until the pale light of dawn began to filter through the trees, a small beacon of hope in the otherwise oppressive darkness. My nerves were frayed, my legs unsteady as I stepped out of the shed, flashlight clutched tightly in my hand. The cemetery stretched out before me, calm and still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was wrong. The air felt thick, like the earth was holding its breath. The statue was gone. I blinked, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. There was no sign of it near the gates, no trace of the stone figure that had moved so slowly, so deliberately over the past few nights. My heart skipped a beat as I scanned the grounds. It had to be here. It couldn't just be gone. But there was no sign of it. No statue. I took a step forward, eyes scanning the cemetery. The graveyard was still, almost eerily so. I walked along the worn path, passing rows of headstones, the names chiseled into the stone faint from years of wear. And then I saw it. It wasn't far, just beyond the rows of graves, tucked into the shadows. I could barely make it out at first, but when I stepped closer, I felt the blood drain from my face. The statue stood there, now positioned in the very center of the cemetery, facing the gates, its stone eyes gleaming in the early light. But something was different. The statue wasn't just standing. It was moving. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the stone figure shifted. Its arm twitched, then its head turned just a fraction. It was as though it were coming to life, inch by inch, piece by piece. My stomach churned as I took a step back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I had seen the statue move before, but this was no longer a subtle shift. This was deliberate, calculated. The statue was waking up. Suddenly the ground beneath my feet seemed to shake, a low rumble vibrating through the earth. I staggered, nearly losing my footing, as if the very soil itself was rebelling against what was happening. My mind raced. What the hell was going on? I couldn't stay here. I turned to run, but then I heard the voice again. "Help me." This time it wasn't a whisper. It was a cry. I froze in place, my heart slamming against my ribs. I knew that voice. It was the voice of someone trapped, someone in agony, but who? What did it mean? The statue's eyes were now fixed on me, its stone gaze unblinking, unyielding. Its arm lifted slightly, almost as if it were reaching for me, and that's when I saw it. At the base of the statue, barely visible in the dirt, were fresh marks, scratches, deep, jagged grooves in the earth, as though something or someone had been trying to escape, trying to break free from beneath. My breath hitched in my throat as the truth finally dawned on me. The statue wasn't just a statue. It had never been a statue. It was a prison, a body, a tomb. The stone had been hollow. It had encased someone who had been buried alive, forgotten by the world, someone whose desperation had left a mark on the earth, on the very foundation of the cemetery itself. And now, that person, that thing, was coming for me. I backed away slowly, my mind scrambling for a way to escape, but it was too late. The ground beneath the statue cracked open, and a hand, human, bony, skeletal, emerged from the dirt. It grasped the stone base, pulling itself up, followed by another, then a head, hollow and grotesque, eyes wide with madness. I screamed, stumbling backward, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I was trapped. I could feel the presence of the thing behind me, its cold breath on my neck, its fingers brushing against my skin. My flashlight fell from my hand, casting a flickering beam across the cemetery, but the light didn't reach far enough to chase away the growing darkness. "Help me!" The voice was no longer a whisper, it was a command. I didn't have the strength to fight, I didn't have the will to escape. The thing, the figure from beneath the stone, was real, and it was angry. With a final desperate scream, I collapsed to the ground and everything went black. The morning after my disappearance, the cemetery was quiet. The workers found my truck parked near the gates, abandoned. My flashlight lay next to the road, its beam still faintly pulsing in the morning light as if it had never been turned off. But there was no trace of me, no sign of where I had gone or what had happened. And when they walked to the center of the cemetery, they found it, the statue, still standing as if it had never moved. The dirt was undisturbed and the handprints, the scratches were gone. But if you look closely enough, if you're brave enough to enter Red Hollow Cemetery after dark, you might just see something out of the corner of your eye, a flicker in the shadows, a glimpse of movement where there should be none. The statue never truly stays in one place for long, and it's waiting.